The dust from her father's boots hadn't even settled before Nora Jenkins heard the words that would carve themselves into her bones. "You'll never be enough for any man worth having, girl, not with that face and that stubborn tongue." It was 1876 in Aurora, Nebraska, a town that existed more as a collection of hopeful structures than an actual settlement, planted on the prairie like seeds that might or might not take root. Nora stood in the doorway of the boarding house her Aunt Miriam ran, watching her father climb onto the westbound stage without a backward glance. He'd left her here 3 months after her mother died, telling anyone who'd listened that his daughter was too plain, too opinionated, and too much trouble to keep around while he pursued silver claims in Colorado. She was 19 years old, and according to every woman in town who'd taken the time to share their opinions, she was already well past her prime for finding a husband. "Don't you listen to him," Aunt Miriam said, appearing beside her with flour-dusted hands and eyes that held more kindness than Nora had seen in months. "Your father is a bitter man who sees his own failures reflected in everyone around him." But the words had already taken root, joining the chorus of voices that had followed Nora since childhood. Too tall for a woman, too dark from working outdoors, hair too straight and plain, features too sharp, voice too direct, dreams too big, wrong, wrong, wrong in every way that mattered. Aurora sat along the Platte River where the prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by scattered homesteads and the occasional ranch. The town consisted of a general store, a church, a saloon, a blacksmith, the boarding house, and about 30 residents who knew everyone else's business before they knew it themselves. Nora had arrived expecting temporary refuge, but 3 years had passed since that day she'd watched her father leave, and she'd built something resembling a life in this wind-swept corner of Nebraska. She worked for her aunt, cleaning rooms and cooking meals for the occasional travelers who passed through, and she helped at the general store when old Mr. Peterson's rheumatism flared. She attended church on Sundays and ignored the pitying looks from married women and the dismissive glances from young men who found her lacking. She saved every penny she could, dreaming of the day she might have enough to buy her own small piece of land, her own chance at independence. The spring of 1879 brought unusual rains to Nebraska, turning the prairie into a sea of grass and wildflowers that seemed to stretch all the way to heaven. It also brought Graham Masters to Aurora, though Nora didn't know his name the first time she saw him. She was walking back from the general store, arms full of supplies, when a rider on a bay horse stopped at the edge of town. He sat still for a long moment, looking at the scattered buildings like a man reading a difficult text, before nudging his horse forward. Nora noticed him because everyone noticed strangers in Aurora, but also because there was something about the set of his shoulders that spoke of weariness deeper than physical exhaustion. He was tall, probably in his middle 20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days of stubble shadowing his jaw. He wore working clothes that had seen better days, and he led a pack horse carrying what looked like all his worldly possessions. He went directly to the boarding house, and by the time Nora arrived home 10 minutes later, Aunt Miriam was already showing him to the room at the end of the hall. "Rancher," Miriam said simply when she came back downstairs. "Looking to buy the old Morrison place." The Morrison ranch had sat empty for 2 years, ever since Samuel Morrison drank himself to death after his wife ran off with a cavalry officer. It was a decent spread of land about 5 miles west of town, with a house that needed work, a barn that needed more work, and grazing land that could support a small herd if someone was willing to put in the effort. "He doesn't look like he has 2 coins to rub together," Nora observed, pulling out flour and lard to start biscuits for supper. Maybe not, Miriam agreed. But he's got something in his eyes that says he'll work himself to death trying. You know the type. Nora did know. The West was full of men chasing dreams just beyond their reach, breaking themselves against the hard reality of this unforgiving land. She'd stopped feeling sorry for them somewhere around her second year in Aurora, when she'd realized that even broken men found wives, found help, found second chances that women like her never seemed to get. Graham Masters came down for supper at 6, as Miriam had instructed. There were 3 other boarders at the table. 2 cowboys passing through on their way to Wyoming, and Mrs. Henderson, a widow waiting for her son to send money for the rest of her journey to California. Nora served the meal as she always did, efficient and quiet, barely registering in the conversation. "You really think you can make a go of the Morrison place?" one of the cowboys asked Graham. "That land's been cursed ever since old Sam bought it." "I don't believe in curses," Graham said. His voice was deeper than Nora expected, and there was a faint accent she couldn't quite place. "Just hard work and bad luck, and I've got experience with both." "Where you from?" the other cowboy asked. "Missouri originally. Been working ranches in Kansas the last 6 years." Graham's answers were short but not unfriendly. "Saved enough to buy my own place. This one's within my means." Nora refilled coffee cups and brought out the apple pie she'd made that morning. When she set a slice in front of Graham, he looked up at her for the first time, really looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "This is the best meal I've had in months." It was a simple statement, probably meant as politeness, but Nora felt her face warm anyway. She nodded and retreated to the kitchen, annoyed at herself for reacting at all. Men like him didn't see women like her, not really. He'd eat her cooking and thank her politely and never think of her again. And that was exactly how it should be. The next morning, Graham was gone before breakfast, riding out to look at the Morrison place in earnest. He came back after dark, ate leftover stew standing up in the kitchen while Nora cleaned, and went straight to his room. This pattern continued for 3 days until Nora's curiosity got the better of her manners. "Is it as bad as they say?" she asked on the 3rd night when he came in covered in dust and cobwebs. Graham looked startled, as if he'd forgotten she could speak. "The house needs a new roof and half the windows replaced. The barn needs structural repairs. The fences are down in a dozen places. The well works, though, and the land is good." He accepted the bowl of stew she handed him. "I can work with that. You'll do all that yourself. Can't afford to hire help." He ate hungrily, like a man who'd forgotten about food until it was in front of him. "I've got enough to buy the place and a small starter herd. The rest I'll have to manage on my own." It was impossible, Nora thought. One man couldn't rebuild a ranch alone, not before winter came and made everything 10 times harder. But she kept that opinion to herself and left him to his meal. 2 weeks later, Graham Masters officially bought the Morrison Ranch from the bank in Lincoln, and Aurora had a new resident. He moved out of the boarding house and onto his land, and Nora assumed that would be the last she saw of him beyond occasional trips into town for supplies. She was wrong. The problem started with bread. Graham came into the general store on a Saturday afternoon in early May, looking frustrated and slightly desperate. "I need bread," he told Mr. Peterson. "And I need someone who can teach me to make it, because I can't keep coming into town every few days, and every loaf I've tried to bake could be used as a building material." Mr. Peterson, who thought of himself as Aurora's unofficial matchmaker, despite a complete lack of success, immediately suggested, "Nora Jenkins makes the best bread in 3 counties. She helps her aunt at the boarding house. I'm sure she'd teach you for a fair price." Nora, who was stacking canned goods on a shelf and had not agreed to any such thing, turned around to protest. But Graham was already looking at her with such hope in his tired eyes that the words stuck in her throat. "Would you?" he asked directly. "I'd pay, of course. And I know it's asking a lot of your time." "I don't know that I have time," Nora started, trying to find a polite escape. "Please." The single word carried weight. "I'm trying to prove something out there, and I can't do it if I'm wasting half a day every week on failed bread attempts." There was something raw in his honesty that caught at Nora's carefully maintained defenses. Besides, she could use the extra money for her savings. "Sunday afternoons," she said. "I'll come out and teach you the basics. 4 lessons should be enough if you pay attention." Relief washed over his face. "Sunday afternoons. That's perfect. Thank you, Miss Jenkins." The title startled her. Most people in Aurora had stopped calling her Miss years ago, as if the courtesy belonged only to women who still had marriage prospects. That first Sunday, Nora borrowed Aunt Miriam's horse and buggy and made the 5-mile journey to the Morrison Ranch with a basket of supplies and low expectations. The day was beautiful, the kind of spring afternoon that made the prairie feel like the most magnificent place on earth, all green grass and endless sky. Meadowlarks sang from fence posts, and the air smelled of sage and rain-washed earth. The ranch looked worse up close than she'd imagined. The house was small, just 3 rooms from what she could see, and the roof sagged in the middle like a tired horse's back. Several windows were covered with oiled paper instead of glass. The barn listed slightly to the left, giving the whole structure a dizzy appearance. But the land rolled away in gentle swells, the grass was thick, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance, maybe 20 head. Graham had been busy. He came out to meet her, wiping his hands on his pants. He looked different than he had at the boarding house, more settled somehow, as if this hard land and broken-down ranch had already started to feel like home. "Miss Jenkins, I wasn't sure you'd really come." "I said I would." Nora climbed down from the buggy with her basket. "Do you have flour, salt, yeast?" "I bought everything on the list you sent with Mr. Peterson." The inside of the house was sparse but surprisingly clean. A table and 2 chairs occupied most of the main room, which also served as the kitchen. She could see a bedroom through one door and what looked like a storage room through another. No decorations, no curtains, nothing that spoke of comfort or permanence. Just a man existing in a space, waiting to see if it would become a home. They spent the next 3 hours working through the process of making bread. Graham was an attentive student, asking questions and taking notes on a scrap of paper. His hands were large and rough from work, but he handled the dough with surprising gentleness, following her instructions carefully. "You knead it until it's smooth and elastic," Nora explained, demonstrating. "Like this, you have to be patient with it." "Patience isn't my strongest quality," Graham admitted, taking over the kneading, "but I'm learning." While the dough rose, they sat at the table with coffee Graham had made, which was at least drinkable. The silence stretched, not quite comfortable but not hostile either. "Why'd you come to Aurora?" Nora asked finally, because the quiet was starting to feel heavy. "There must be better opportunities elsewhere." Graham looked out the window at his struggling ranch. "I spent 6 years working for other men, building their dreams while mine stayed out of reach. I saved every penny, and this is what I could afford. Maybe it's not much, but it's mine. That matters. Even if it breaks you, even then." He looked at her directly, and she saw determination in his eyes that reminded her of her own reflection when she let herself dream about independence. "I'd rather fail at my own dream than succeed at someone else's." Nora understood that in her bones. "People think I'm foolish for not trying harder to catch a husband," she said, surprising herself with the confession. They say I should be grateful for any man who'd take me, but I'd rather stand on my own than settle for someone who sees me as a last resort." Something shifted in Graham's expression, a recognition passing between them like a secret handshake. "Then we're two fools together," he said quietly. "The world could probably use more of our kind." The bread came out of the oven golden and perfect, filling the small house with a smell that felt like hope. Graham tore off a piece while it was still steaming, tasted it, and actually smiled, transforming his serious face into something unexpectedly warm. "I'll never make it this good," he said. "Not with that attitude. Practice, Mr. Masters. That's all anything takes." "Graham," he corrected. "If you're going to teach me to make bread, we can probably move past formalities." "Nora, then." She packed up her things as the afternoon shadows grew long, and Graham pressed payment into her hands along with a loaf of the bread they'd made together. "Same time next week?" he asked. "Same time," she agreed. The second lesson came and went, focused on variations and troubleshooting. The third lesson expanded to other basic cooking skills, because Graham admitted he was living mainly on beans and salt pork. By the fourth lesson, Nora realized she was looking forward to Sunday afternoons in a way she hadn't looked forward to anything in years. Graham was easy to talk to once he relaxed. He told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, losing both parents to cholera when he was 16, working his way west with nothing but determination and a stubborn refusal to quit. She told him about her mother's death, her father's abandonment, the weight of being told your whole life that you're not enough. "That's a lie," Graham said flatly when she mentioned her father's parting words. They were sitting on the porch steps after the fourth lesson, watching the sun paint the prairie gold and orange. "The cruel words that people speak tell you everything about them and nothing about you. Easy to say. True nonetheless." He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "You're one of the most capable people I've met, man or woman. You run that boarding house, help at the store, and you just taught a hopeless case like me to make edible food. Anyone who can't see your worth is blind." Nora's throat tightened. "You don't have to say things like that." "I'm not saying it to be kind. I'm saying it because it's true." He stood, brushing dust from his pants. "Same time next week. I thought maybe you could show me how to make that stew you brought that first night." The lessons had technically ended, but Nora found herself saying, "Same time next week." Summer arrived in earnest, bringing heat that shimmered off the prairie and storms that rolled across the sky like invading armies. Nora continued riding out to Graham's ranch every Sunday, though the lessons had long since expanded beyond cooking. She helped him plant a kitchen garden, teaching him which vegetables would survive the Nebraska climate. He showed her the improvements he'd made to the barn, the slow progress on the house, the way his cattle herd was adapting to the grazing land. They worked side by side in companionable silence or easy conversation, and something grew between them that Nora was afraid to name. It felt too fragile, too precious, too likely to shatter if she examined it too closely. In town, people started to notice. Mrs. Henderson mentioned to Aunt Miriam that it was unseemly for an unmarried woman to spend so much time alone with a bachelor rancher. Miriam, to her credit, told Mrs. Henderson to mind her own business, but she also pulled Nora aside one evening. "Are you being careful?" she asked gently. "We're friends," Nora said, the word tasting insufficient even as she spoke it. "That's all. Honey, I've seen the way that man looks at you when he comes into town. That's not friendship in his eyes." Nora's heart jumped, but she forced herself to stay practical. "Then he'll realize his mistake soon enough. Men like Graham Masters don't end up with women like me." "What does that mean, women like you?" "Plain. Difficult. Too old and too poor and too everything wrong." Miriam grabbed Nora's shoulders, forcing her to meet her eyes. Your father poisoned your mind, and this town's done nothing to heal it. But that doesn't make the poison true. When are you going to see yourself the way the rest of us do? But Nora couldn't answer that. The voices in her head were too loud, too practiced, too much a part of her foundation to remove without collapse. The crisis came in late July. Graham had hired 2 men from a neighboring ranch to help him replace the barn's structural beams, a job too big and dangerous for one person. Nora had arrived for her usual Sunday visit to find the work in progress, so she'd stayed inside, cleaning Graham's perpetually dusty house and starting supper. She heard the shout through the open window, followed by a crash that shook the ground. She ran outside to find one of the support beams had slipped, bringing down part of the barn's framework. The hired men were clear, but Graham was underneath, pinned by a heavy timber across his leg. The next hour passed in a blur of adrenaline and terror. They got the beam off him, revealing a leg that was clearly broken, bent at an angle that made Nora's stomach turn. The hired men wanted to ride for the doctor in the next town, a journey that would take hours, but Graham's face was gray with pain and Nora knew they didn't have time to waste. "Help me get him into the house," she ordered, falling into the competence that crisis always brought out in her. "Then one of you ride for the doctor, the other stay in case I need help." They got Graham inside and onto his bed. Nora sent one man off on the fastest horse and set the other to boiling water and finding clean cloth. Then she was alone with Graham, whose eyes were glazed with pain but fixed on her face. "I need to set the leg before the doctor gets here," she said, trying to sound calmer than she felt. "It's going to hurt. Do what you need to do." His voice was strained but steady. Nora had helped set broken bones before. Living on the edge of civilization meant learning basic medical skills whether you wanted to or not, but this was different. This was Graham, and her hands shook as she examined the break, determining the best way to realign the bone. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and then she pulled. Graham's shout of pain cut through her like a knife, but the bone shifted back into place. She worked quickly, splinting the leg with boards and strips of torn sheet, trying to ignore the tears running down her face. When she finished, Graham had passed out, which was probably a mercy. The doctor didn't arrive until well after dark. He examined Nora's work, adjusted the splint slightly, and gave her an approving nod. "You did well, Miss Jenkins. You might have saved his leg, getting that bone set quickly." The words felt hollow against the fear still coursing through her veins. She sat beside Graham's bed all night, watching him sleep fitfully, changing the cool cloth on his forehead when fever set in around midnight. The hired man had gone home, promising to check back the next day. Aunt Miriam would be worried, but Nora couldn't bring herself to leave. Graham woke near dawn, his eyes clearer but exhausted. "Nora, I'm here." She moved closer, relief flooding through her. "How do you feel?" "Like a barn fell on me." He tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. "Did you stay all night?" "Someone had to make sure you didn't do anything foolish like try to walk." He reached for her hand, his grip weak but deliberate. "Thank you for everything." Nora looked down at their joined hands, at this man who'd somehow become essential to her life in just a few short months, and something inside her cracked open. "You scared me," she whispered. "When I saw you under that beam, I thought—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm all right. Thanks to you, I'm all right." But the fear had stripped away her carefully maintained defenses, leaving her raw and exposed. "I should go. Aunt Miriam will be worried." "Nora, wait." Graham struggled to sit up, wincing. "Please, we need to talk. You need to rest." "I need to say this before I lose my nerve." He kept hold of her hand, his eyes intense despite his weakened state. "These past few months, Having you here, working beside you, talking with you, it's become the best part of my life. You're the best part of my life. And yesterday, lying under that beam thinking I might die, all I could think was that I never told you how I feel. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. Graham, don't. You're in pain, you're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. He pulled her closer, his voice urgent. I love you, Nora. I think I have since that first Sunday when you came out here and treated me like an equal instead of a charity case. I love your competence and your strength and your terrible jokes and the way you face the world like a fighter. I love everything about you, and I need you to know that before another minute passes. The words hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrifying. Every voice in Nora's head screamed that this was wrong, impossible, a mistake she'd regret. You don't mean that, she said, her voice shaking. You're grateful, that's all. Once you're healed, once you remember that you could have anyone, I don't want anyone, I want you. Graham's grip on her hand tightened. And before you list all the reasons why you think I shouldn't, let me say this. You are the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever met. You're beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with what small-minded people think beauty should be. You're exactly what I need, what I want, what I dream about. You're not too anything except maybe too good for a struggling rancher who'll probably be paying off this land until he's 60. Tears streamed down Nora's face, years of pain and doubt warring with the hope blooming in her chest. They told me I'd never be enough. My father, this town, everyone. They said I should be grateful for scraps. Then they're all fools. Graham brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. You're not enough, Nora. You're more than I ever hoped for, more than I deserve. And if you could find it in yourself to take a chance on me, on us, I swear I'll spend every day proving that you made the right choice. The wall around Nora's heart, built brick by brick from every cruel word and dismissive glance, finally crumbled. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to Graham's, letting herself believe for the first time that maybe, just maybe, she could be loved exactly as she was. I love you too, she whispered. I've been so afraid to admit it, even to myself. But I do. I love you so much it terrifies me. Graham's smile was radiant despite his pain. Then say you'll marry me. Say you'll build this dream with me as partners, equal partners in everything. You're asking me to marry you while you're lying in bed with a broken leg. I'm asking you to marry me because I nearly lost my chance yesterday, and I'm not stupid enough to waste another day. He touched her face gently, wiping away her tears. Marry me, Nora Jenkins. Make me the luckiest man in Nebraska. The yes rose up from somewhere deep inside her, from the part that had never stopped hoping despite everything. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. Graham pulled her down for a kiss that tasted like tears and coffee and the beginning of everything new. The next few weeks were chaos. Graham's broken leg meant he couldn't manage the ranch alone, so Nora moved out to the Morrison place, propriety be damned. Aunt Miriam understood, helping her pack and ignoring the disapproving whispers from certain quarters of Aurora. The hired men came back to finish the barn repairs, and Nora learned to manage the cattle and horses while Graham directed operations from a chair on the porch. They were married in early September in Aurora's small church, with Aunt Miriam and Mr. Peterson as witnesses and half the town in attendance, despite their earlier gossip. Nora wore a simple blue dress she'd made herself, and Graham stood with the help of a cane, still limping but healing well. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Graham kissed her in front of everyone with such obvious love that even the most disapproving tongues were temporarily silenced. The ranching life was harder than Nora had imagined, but she'd never been afraid of hard work. She learned to ride better, to manage cattle, to make repairs and manage accounts. Graham healed slowly but surely, and by the first snow, he was walking without the cane, though his leg would always ache before storms. They worked the ranch together through that first winter, huddled in their small house while blizzards raged outside, planning for spring. Graham taught Nora everything he knew about ranching, and she brought her own intelligence and work ethic to every problem. They were partners in truth, making decisions together, building their dreams side by side. The next spring brought their first major success, a bumper calf crop that let them expand the herd and finally make significant repairs to the house. Graham replaced the roof himself, while Nora put in real glass windows and built proper shelves for their growing collection of books. The house transformed slowly from a shelter into a home, filled with small comforts they added piece by piece. In the evenings, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie, and Nora marveled at how thoroughly her life had changed. She was building something that belonged to her, loved by a man who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. The voices from her past still whispered sometimes, but Graham's love had taught her a new truth. She had always been enough. The world had just been looking at her wrong. 2 years into their marriage, Nora discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. They were doing well enough, but money was still tight, and raising a child on the frontier was fraught with danger. But Graham's excitement was infectious, and Nora let herself dream about the family they were creating. Their son was born in the spring of 1882, delivered by Aunt Miriam with Graham pacing anxiously outside. They named him Thomas, after Graham's father, and he was healthy and loud and perfect. Nora held her son and felt another piece of her broken foundation heal. She was a mother now, and she would make sure Thomas never doubted his worth for a single moment. The ranch continued to grow. Graham proved to be an excellent rancher, and Nora's head for business helped them avoid the pitfalls that claimed so many homesteaders. They hired seasonal help during roundup and drive season, and Graham began to build a reputation for honest dealing and quality cattle. The Morrison Ranch, rechristened the Master's Ranch, became one of the more successful operations in the area. In 1884, their daughter was born. They named her Sarah, and she had her mother's sharp features and her father's determination. Thomas, now 2, was suspicious of his sister at first, but he quickly became her fierce protector. The house rang with children's laughter, transforming it completely from the desperate bachelor quarters it had been when Graham first arrived. Life wasn't perfect. Droughts came and went, taking their toll on the herd. Harsh winters tested their resources and their resolve. Thomas fell seriously ill when he was 4, and Nora spent 3 terrifying days nursing him through a fever before it finally broke. Sarah broke her arm falling from a horse when she was 6, and Graham blamed himself for weeks, despite everyone telling him accidents happened. But through all the challenges, Nora and Graham faced everything together. They built their ranch into something substantial, a legacy they could pass to their children. They proved all the doubters wrong, including the voices in Nora's own head that had told her she'd never be enough. The town of Aurora grew around them. More families came, drawn by the promise of cheap land and opportunity. The railroad arrived in 1885, connecting them more thoroughly to the wider world. Graham and Nora became respected members of the community, known for their hard work and their willingness to help neighbors in need. Aunt Miriam sold the boarding house in 1886 and moved out to the ranch, taking over a room they'd added specifically for her. She was getting older, and Nora couldn't bear the thought of her aunt living alone in town. Miriam became an essential part of their household, teaching the children to read and helping Nora manage the garden and the chickens while Graham and his hired men worked the cattle. In 1888, their third child arrived, another boy they named Daniel. Thomas was 6 and Sarah was 4, both old enough to be excited about a baby brother. The house they'd steadily expanded over the years now had 5 bedrooms, a proper parlor, and a kitchen that was Nora's pride and joy. The barn stood straight and strong, housing horses and equipment. The pastures stretched far and wide, dotted with hundreds of head of cattle bearing the master's brand. One evening in the summer of 1889, Nora and Graham sat on their porch, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set behind them. Thomas was teaching Sarah how to rope a fence post, both of them concentrating intensely. Daniel toddled around nearby, supervised by Aunt Miriam, who sat in a rocking chair knitting. The prairie stretched out before them, golden in the fading light, and Nora felt a contentment so deep it brought tears to her eyes. "What are you thinking?" Graham asked, taking her hand. It was a ritual between them, this evening question, a way of staying connected despite the chaos of ranch life and raising children. "I'm thinking about the day my father told me I'd never be enough," Nora said quietly, "and about how grateful I am that he was wrong." Graham squeezed her hand. "He wasn't wrong. You weren't enough. You're more, Nora. You're everything." She turned to look at her husband, this man who'd seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, who'd loved her through her doubts and fears, who'd built a life with her that exceeded both their dreams. "We did well, didn't we?" she asked. "Starting with nothing, we built something that matters. We did better than well. We built a home, a family, a future." Graham pulled her close, kissing her temple. "And I'd do it all again, every hard moment, just to end up right here with you." Thomas successfully roped the fence post and whooped in victory. Sarah clapped and demanded her turn. Daniel laughed at his siblings' antics, and Miriam smiled at all of them with obvious love. The prairie wind carried the smell of grass and cattle, and the approaching rain that would nourish their land. Nora Jenkins Masters looked at her life, at everything she'd built from dust and determination and unexpected love, and knew with absolute certainty that she was enough. She had always been enough. She was exactly what was needed, exactly where she was meant to be. The years continued to roll by with the seasons. Thomas grew tall and serious, taking after his father in temperament and his love of the land. He learned ranching from Graham with a dedication that promised he'd carry on the family legacy. Sarah was wild and fearless, more comfortable on horseback than on her own feet, with a sharp mind that saw solutions to problems before anyone else. Daniel was gentle and thoughtful, with a gift for handling animals that bordered on magical. The ranch thrived under Graham's management and Nora's practical business sense, becoming one of the most successful operations in the region. In 1892, they added a 4th child to their family, another daughter they named Margaret. She arrived during a spring thunderstorm, as if announcing herself to the world with appropriate drama. Margaret had Nora's straight brown hair and Graham's easy smile, and from the moment she could walk, she followed Nora everywhere, determined to learn everything her mother knew. The children grew up working the ranch, learning the value of hard work and the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. They attended the school that Aurora had finally built in 1890, riding into town together on horseback, regardless of weather. Thomas was 14, Sarah 12, Daniel 9, and Margaret 5, and they were as close as siblings could be despite their different personalities. Nora watched her children grow and marveled at how different their lives were from her own childhood. They were confident, loved, certain of their place in the world. They would never doubt their worth because she and Graham told them every day, in words and actions, that they were valued exactly as they were. Aunt Miriam passed away peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1893. She was 72 years old, and she'd lived to see Nora happy and successful, which she'd said many times was all she'd ever wanted. They buried her on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a stone marker that read Miriam Foster, beloved aunt and friend. Nora grieved deeply, but she was grateful that Miriam had spent her final years surrounded by family and love rather than alone in a boarding house. The century turned as centuries do, bringing changes both gradual and sudden. Aurora transformed from a collection of hopeful buildings into an actual town with a bank, a school, multiple churches, and even a small hotel. The railroad brought more people, more opportunities, and more challenges. But the master's ranch remained constant, a testament to what two people could build when they worked together toward a common dream. In 1895, Thomas met a young woman named Emily Crawford at a church social, and Graham and Nora watched their eldest son fall in love with the same headlong intensity his father had shown. Emily was smart and kind, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and she fit into their family as if she'd always been meant to be there. Thomas and Emily were married in 1896, and they built a house on the eastern section of the ranch, planning to take over more of the operation as Graham got older. Sarah shocked no one by declaring at 16 that she had no intention of marrying young, or possibly ever. She wanted to see more of the world before settling down, and Graham supported her completely, though Nora worried about her headstrong daughter facing a world that wasn't always kind to independent women. Still, Sarah had been raised to believe in her own worth, and Nora had to trust that foundation would hold. Daniel showed promise as a veterinarian, and they made plans to send him to school in Lincoln when he was old enough, despite the cost. Graham insisted that each child should have the opportunity to find their own path, even if that path led away from the ranch. Margaret, at 10 years old, announced that she intended to help her mother run the business side of the ranch forever, and Nora felt her heart swell with pride at her youngest daughter's determination. One evening in the fall of 1897, Nora and Graham celebrated their 18th wedding anniversary. Their children had conspired with Emily to prepare a special dinner, and the whole family gathered around the expanded dining table they'd built to accommodate everyone. The house was full of laughter and conversation, the kind of joyful chaos that comes from a large, loving family. After dinner, Graham pulled Nora onto the porch away from the crowd inside. 18 years, he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Feels like both forever and no time at all. Nora leaned back against him, comfortable and safe. Do you ever regret it? We could have had an easier life. Not for 1 second. Graham's voice was firm. Every hard moment, every challenge, every struggle, it was all worth it to build this life with you. You're still more than I ever hoped for, Nora. You always will be. She turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd changed everything. There was silver in his dark hair now, and lines around his eyes from years of squinting at the sun, but he was still the same Graham who'd asked her to teach him to make bread all those years ago. I love you, she said simply. More now than even on the day I married you. That's good, Graham said with a smile, because I'm planning on loving you for at least another 50 years. That's a long time, not nearly long enough. They kissed on their porch, surrounded by the land they'd built together and the family they'd created, and Nora felt complete. She'd spent 19 years being told she wasn't enough, but she'd spent 18 years being loved exactly as she was. The second story had proven stronger than the first. The years moved forward with increasing speed, the way time seems to accelerate when life is full. Thomas and Emily welcomed their first child in 1898, a son they named Graham after his grandfather. Nora held her first grandchild and felt the wheel of life turn, remembering when she'd held her own firstborn with the same mixture of terror and joy. Sarah left for Denver in 1899, determined to see the city and experience life beyond the prairie. She promised to write, and she kept that promise, sending letters full of her adventures and observations. Graham worried, but Nora understood her daughter's need to prove herself in the wider world. Sarah had inherited that drive from both her parents. Daniel began his veterinary studies in Lincoln in 1900, coming home for summers to help with the ranch and court a sweet girl named Rachel who worked at the general store. Margaret, now 15, had indeed taken over much of the ranch's bookkeeping, showing a head for numbers that exceeded even Nora's abilities. The 20th century brought automobiles and telephones, and other wonders that seemed impossible. Aurora got electric lights in 1902, though the ranch wouldn't have electricity for several more years. The world was changing rapidly, but some things remained constant: the cycle of seasons, the work of ranching, the importance of family. In 1903, Sarah came home. She'd spent 4 years in Denver working as a bookkeeper and experiencing city life, and she'd decided that while the city had its charms, her heart belonged to the prairie. She was 21 now, confident and well-traveled, and she announced her intention to start her own horse breeding operation on the southern section of the ranch. Graham was delighted, and he helped her plan the venture with enthusiasm. Thomas and Emily had 3 children by 1905. Graham, who was 7, a daughter named Clara, who was 4, and twin boys named John and James, who were 2. The main house rang with grandchildren's laughter, and Nora couldn't remember ever being happier. She was 46 years old, healthy and strong, surrounded by the family she'd built and the love she'd found. Daniel finished his veterinary training in 1905 and married Rachel that same year. They built a house in Aurora, where Daniel opened a practice serving the region's ranchers and farmers. He was successful almost immediately, known for his skill and his gentle way with animals. Margaret surprised everyone by falling in love with a young man named Peter Morrison, the nephew of the ranch's previous owner, who'd come west to see his uncle's old land. Peter was a teacher, quiet and bookish, seemingly the opposite of the practical, numbers-focused Margaret. But they complemented each other perfectly, and they married in 1906, planning to settle in Aurora where Peter could teach at the school. One Sunday in 1908, the entire family gathered at the ranch for dinner. It had become a tradition over the years, this weekly gathering that brought everyone together despite increasingly busy lives. Thomas and Emily were there with their 4 children. Daniel and Rachel came from town with their infant daughter. Margaret and Peter arrived with news that Margaret was expecting. Sarah brought her business partner, a woman named Catherine who'd moved from Omaha to help with the horse breeding operation. Graham was 52 now, still strong but moving a bit slower than he used to. Nora was 49, her hair streaked with silver but her energy undiminished. They looked around their crowded table at their children and grandchildren and the extended family they'd built, and felt blessed beyond measure. "Should we tell them?" Graham whispered to Nora as the meal wound down. Nora nodded, her eyes bright. Graham stood, tapping his glass for attention. "Nora and I have an announcement. We've decided it's time to start stepping back from the day-to-day operations of the ranch. Thomas, you and Emily have proven more than capable of managing the cattle operation. Sarah, your horse breeding business is thriving. We're officially making you both full partners in the Masters Ranch." The announcement was met with surprise and excitement. Thomas looked overwhelmed, Emily proud, Sarah thoughtful. "This doesn't mean we're retiring," Nora added quickly. "We'll still be here, still helping. But it's time for the next generation to take the lead. This ranch is your legacy now, just as much as it's ours." Later, after everyone had gone home or to their own houses on the property, Nora and Graham sat on their porch in the gathering darkness. It was the same porch where they'd sat countless evenings before, watching sunsets and storms and the steady march of stars across the prairie sky. "We did it," Nora said softly. "We built something that will outlast us." "You did it," Graham corrected. "You took a broken-down ranch and a struggling rancher and turned them into something worthwhile." "We did it together," Nora insisted. "That's how it's always been." Graham pulled her close and they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Cattle lowing in the distance, horses moving in the pasture, the wind that never stopped singing through the grass. "You remember the day we met?" Graham asked. "You were carrying supplies and I was dusty and desperate, trying to figure out if I'd made a terrible mistake coming to Aurora." "I thought you looked tired," Nora said. "Like you were carrying the weight of the world." "I was, until I found someone to help me carry it." He kissed her forehead. "Best decision I ever made, asking you to teach me to make bread." Nora laughed. "Best 50 cents I ever earned. Only 50 cents, I underpaid you terribly." "You made up for it." They fell silent again, content in each other's presence. The moon rose over the prairie, painting everything silver. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed 10. Another day was ending and another would begin tomorrow, bringing its own challenges and joys. "Nora." Graham's voice was soft in the darkness. "Yes, thank you, for taking a chance on me. For building this life with me. For being exactly who you are." Nora felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind, the kind that came from being overwhelmed by happiness. "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did, for loving me when I couldn't love myself, for proving that I was more than enough all along." "You're more than I ever hoped for," Graham said, repeating the words he'd spoken so many years ago. "You always have been. You always will be." They sat on their porch until the moon was high and the night was deep. Two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. The prairie stretched out before them, the same prairie that had witnessed their struggles and their triumphs, their tears and their laughter, their love. And in the morning, they would wake and work the land side by side, as they'd done for more than 20 years. They would watch their grandchildren grow and their children thrive. They would face whatever challenges came with the same determination that had carried them through everything else. But for now, in this perfect moment, they simply sat together in the darkness, grateful for the journey that had brought them here and the love that had made it all worthwhile. Nora Jenkins, who'd been told she'd never be enough, had found a man who saw her worth. Graham Masters, who'd arrived in Aurora with nothing but determination and a dream, had found a partner who'd helped him build a legacy. Together, they'd proved that sometimes the most powerful thing you can give another person is the simple truth. You are enough. You are more than enough. You are exactly what I need, exactly what I hoped for, exactly right. And that truth had been enough to build a life on, strong enough to weather any storm, deep enough to last forever. The story of Nora and Graham Masters became part of Aurora's history, told to newcomers as an example of what hard work and true partnership could achieve. Their ranch continued to thrive for generations, passing from their children to their grandchildren and beyond, always keeping the name Masters Ranch in honor of the two people who'd built it from nothing. But the real legacy wasn't the land or the cattle or the buildings. It was the love story that had started with a simple request for bread-making lessons and grown into something that proved the power of seeing another person's worth, of choosing partnership over pride, of building together rather than alone. Years later, when Nora was old and gray but still sharp-minded and strong-willed, her grandchildren would ask her the secret to a good marriage, a good life, a good legacy. And she would smile, take Graham's hand as she always did, and say simply, "Find someone who sees you clearly and loves what they see. Then work like hell to build something worth having. That's all. That's everything." It was the truth she'd learned in a small town on the Nebraska prairie, taught to her by a rancher who'd looked past what the world said she was and seen who she really was all along. And it was a truth worth passing down through all the generations that followed, a light to guide them through their own doubts and struggles, their own journeys toward finding where and with whom they belonged. The end.